Okay, thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. I'm Jennifer Parker from the Wales Systems Forum and the Schumacher Institute, and I want to thank the Public Health Network for inviting me to give this presentation. So talking about systems thinking, why am I starting off with a lovely picture from Cardiff horticultural show before the pandemic, I should add? Well, partly just as an interesting sort of way to start, because what we're confronted with here, and very pretty and fun it is too, is a highly organized set of individual bunches of flowers, all with their different characteristics, all grouped with, you know, the same ones together and labeled and separated out and displayed against a black screen so we can see them all. But this kind of uniformity and organization is very unusual in our world. And of course, in actual fact, to achieve this result takes a tremendous amount of background work. As you may know, if you're interested in flowers and plants, which I must say I really am, in order to get all these blooming so wonderfully at the time of the show, which was May, some of these will have had to be put into a cold store and their development halted, etc., etc. And of course, there's a massive process of human breeding behind all this, which has taken a lot of time over years, and some of these varieties may indeed be centuries old. So, you know, a lot of the ways in which information can be presented to us kind of resembles this kind of organization. And of course, the world is a much more messy and interconnected place. And that's partly why I'm going to say that systems thinking is useful for us, because it helps us deal with this real complexity. So what I'm going to do is to just give a sort of general introduction and talk a bit about why I think that systems is so interesting, and hope to enthuse you a little if you don't already know about it. And a little bit of the history of systems. And then I'm going to look at something which we're all too familiar with, but perhaps don't always see in this light, which is what is the societal learning from the pandemic? I'm going to propose a few things that we already know, I think, perhaps remind us about some of these things, but also give a bit of a systems analytic approach, suggest a few extra dimensions that systems thinking helps us understand, perhaps. And then I'm going to end up with a bit of a conclusion around some of the ways that systems, tools and approaches might be useful in public health. So, complexity, systems thinking and Wales. We do have, as we all know, we are in a situation of very volatile change, and it can be quite disturbing, but it can also inspire people to work together. And I want to say that if we can approach it, you know, in systems in a conscious way, and perhaps recognize the mess, a lot of the elements of the mess that we're in, we may be able to work together more effectively. And this diagram to the right is just a kind of indication of the kind of ways that some of the issues work together. This is in relation to food, the food system, some pollution issues, and human public health. It's just a kind of example. But actually, systems thinking is not unusual to us. we do actually, as humans, we inhabit many different kinds of systems, and we work with them all the time. We would be very hard put to it to survive in our complex society if we didn't know how to engage with all these different areas. And of course, it is incredibly complex, and some people do have problems working with all these areas, but the fact is that we do all do systems thinking all the time in various different areas. And these different four main areas that are outlined here just also give a very brief indication of the kind of interdisciplinarity that we're looking at with regard to when we look at systems thinking. And when we think about complex determinants of health, they go right across these different systems. And of course, they completely interact. As human beings, we are biophysical creatures, but we also find our livelihoods within complex areas of production, our engagement with the biophysical world. We also engage and work through and live in societies which have norms, laws, and constraints, and also hopefully enable us to live good lives. And the cultural elements are enormously important. And here, when you're thinking about people, you need to include very much the psychological elements. And all the things that happen to us in our lives, but if we belong to certain groups, we may have more problems right across the board here, and we'll come on to that a bit later. So fortunately, we are fortunate in Wales to have well-being goals, and this is a great step forward and is recognised globally as a great place to start. We've got principles and frameworks that encourage us to think up in a joined up way. And, this is an incredibly important starting point. But we do have a bit of a gap here, an action gap, if you like. And I guess one of the reasons that myself and other people have started the Wales Systems Forum, and many others in Wales, of course, are working on systems areas, is that we believe that systems thinking can help us make these good intentions become more real, become actual. So just to give a very brief description of what I call the adventure of systems, because I am a bit of a nerd, I suppose, about knowledge, and I do find it really exciting, and I especially enjoy working with other people on these areas. Just to say first off that this picture on the right is a picture which indicates some key elements of Earth system science, and which is a very, very important area of system science. So I'll come back to that in a minute a bit more, but you don't need to understand all the ins and outs of it to get the general idea that it's a dynamic system with outputs and feedbacks, which acts as a whole and changes over time. So, I mean, systems thinking really got going in the ecological revolution. So we had done a lot of work, I say us humans, had done a lot of work on biological organisms and looking at them individually. But the ecological revolution started to think about populations and individuals in an ecosystem in relationship to each other, and how those relationships evolved over time. And this was a massive breakthrough and contributed to the theory of evolution, which was, again, groundbreaking. I would say we still haven't caught up with all the implications of evolutionary theory, and we're still exploring it in many ways. And then systems thinking also, people started to look at the economy and society in terms of systems. And this is, Marx is obviously a famous example, who looked at drivers in the system, particularly around capital. But he also, ecological thinking has also influenced some figures more to the right, including Nozick, who had a view that people needed to have, that the economy was comprised of all these different little individual life experiments, and that was partly what gave it life. And if you have too much strong state intervention, he argued, this squashes the life out of the economy. And maybe there's elements of both that have some cogency. Systems thinking is definitely very important in new economy thinking and the whole debate around well-being economy. And I've been involved in some of that. And it's a great advantage that Wales has just recently signed up to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance of governments. But what does that mean, and how are we going to make that really real for the people of Wales is a really strong question. And I think systems thinking can help us. Two people you may have heard of, Peter Senge and John Seddon. Peter Senge is a very influential systems thinker who's developed a real marvelous sort of toolkit, you could say, of approaches, but mostly in the context of corporate organizations and change, but they can very readily be applied to different situations. John Seddon, I know, is known in Wales, particularly perhaps in local government, for his arguments against bringing in managerial approaches to the public sector that are suitable for for-profit organisations. And John Seddon identified very clearly in his critique in systems thinking in the public services that, public services are not geared towards a simple metric, i.e. profit. They're geared towards complex outcomes, and those are now, more defined in the Welsh context as well-being outcomes. And those are the goals of the system. And that means we have to find more complex and suitable ways of measuring how the system is successful or not. I've mentioned Earth system science and climate science. And if we just look to the right here, some of the interactions that we're seeing, the heat exchange sort of from the oceans to the atmosphere and back again, the water cycle, water evaporates and then again precipitates. And thank goodness it does, because the water is essential for life across the whole of our living systems. And we've built these very complex pieces of infrastructure and placed them into a biological system without, of course, when through the Industrial Revolution, nobody was thinking about the holistic or global impacts of any of this. But now we are, and part of the reason that we are able to do that is because of the development of systems thinking and ways of modelling. And modelling in Earth system science it's complex, but you can understand the elements that need to be in it, and it's quite amazing if you just take a few minutes to look at how incredibly well many of these models do actually help to, they are great fits to the history of our climate. So you can start them off working at a particular historical point, and they will faithfully reproduce pretty much what happened over that period of time. But of course, there are many, many complex inputs and outputs, and models are limited. You can't put everything into a model. The map is not the territory. And so that means that they're always going to be approximate, and they're going to work within a frame of indeterminacy. They're going to be correct within certain limits. And that's very much the case with all the very important life sciences, including health systems. And, especially when we come to thinking about social structures and their interactions with health, there's no way we would be able to produce precise predictions, but actually that doesn't necessarily matter as long as we understand the main drivers in the system, I would argue. And I think that's one of the key things that we can really learn from and apply. And just as a final note, one of the developing interdisciplinary system sciences is neuroscience, which helps us understand how our minds work. And just as if you're feeling a little bit, oh gosh, all this complexity is a bit overwhelming, take heart, because you have an amazing unconscious system as part of your mind. Your conscious attention is like a beam of light, which is focused on a very small part of reality. But your unconscious mind is incredibly good at doing complex processing. So if you get it on side with you, it can help you deal with complexity. We may have time to get back to that. So some of the key elements of systems dynamics. So systems dynamics was developed, but primarily by somebody called Jay Forrester, and was about a sort of set of rules and an approach to how you could model things in a system. And some of the key features that we do see in climate are feedbacks. So, for example, one of the things that we might, in our response to the climate getting warmer, unintentionally create feedbacks that make the situation worse. So, for example, if we all start using air conditioning when it gets terribly hot, we'll be using more energy, which could very well be coal-based, and this will actually make the climate change worse. So that's a feedback. That's a feedback which is undesirable. But we can have balancing feedbacks. So, for example, one of the ways that the body balances its temperature is through sweating. That's a balancing feedback. This is a biological feedback. We also understand time lags in the system. So, for example, when you've got a massive complex system, a change in something over here is going to take quite a long time to work its way through, and there are time lags. And that is the case with climate change. What we're currently experiencing in the way of global climate change impacts is the legacy from our greenhouse gas emissions of up to 25 to 50 years ago. And we are going to have to adapt to some degree of climate change. However, how much we can do to diminish our emissions now, which we really must. Then we think about scales. Well, and this is something that, again, if I illustrate it with respect to climate, and all these points are going to come up again later when we look at epidemiology, we think, well, how do the scales interact? So if we do something as a family to save energy or, diminish our emissions, what impact does that have at different levels of this system? Where are the big levers that we can all that we can see to make big change? But then again, big change is also the result of lots and lots of people doing small changes. So, when we're thinking about strategies, we always need to be thinking about the different scales and what's appropriate at different scales, but also how perhaps, rules, for example, at a national or regional level might be hindering or helping us in our aims to achieve local improvements. Because, everything at the end of the day is local. We all live somewhere. We are all embodied and have to be somewhere. That we're all, reality is local, if you like, but we organize it in many, many different ways in our human systems. Tipping points are an interesting one, and I guess I could, just to change the focus, illustrate a social tipping point. And sometimes, there's lots of pointers to possible change happening socially, but it's very, very hard to predict. But suddenly there comes a point when there's a critical mass of people doing, things for change, which actually helps tip the system into a new shape, or something happens that is so significant that you say, actually, it's never going to be the same again. And I guess a classic example is the Berlin Wall coming down. I think this is a cause for optimism. And, that it may seem as often as though all the things we're doing are not having an effect, but actually sometimes it's really difficult to test or judge whether they are or not. And we are all trying to contribute to changes to a better society. And then we can think about designing transitional strategies. So if we want to change to a society which is run according to, delivering on well-being goals and isn't destroying the environment that we depend upon, we're going to need to engage in a transition or a systems transformation. And how do we actually do that? What kind of tools have we got for helping us develop these strategies? And I've mentioned before the uncertainty that is endemic to any complex system. And that's often, all these factors are often what people mean by wicked problems. Yeah, I'm never sure whether that's a helpful concept or not, because I think it can sound like you can't really come to grips with them. But I think that systems thinking can help you begin to get to grips with things that look almost impossible. In terms of learning from the pandemic, and the reason I put up this picture here is this is a bit of dyeing from a friend of mine who uses plant dyes, because it's sort of, I put this up because you can sort of see possible shapes emerging from this, but it's quite fuzzy. And your imagination could produce possibly different accounts of what this was. So now we're just thinking about systems thinking as helping us get an overview and helping patterns emerge. And I'm just going to say that some of the patterns that I think began to emerge during the pandemic. And I just wanted to mention my colleague, Vala Ragnarsdottir, who's a professor of sustainability at the University of Iceland, who also contributed to the thoughts in this section. So there's a lot of stuff that has come out from the pandemic. The origins of the pandemic being apparently, it seems, in the proximity of animals and humans, and where this is unhelpful. So where we're people are selling wild animals for food in markets. This seemed to be a very plausible route for the start of the pandemic. There was some interesting data that came in when we stopped traveling because of various lockdowns. But the ones I really wanted to concentrate on, are these ones highlighted here. That we sort of, across the world, we saw developing understanding of epidemiology as a systems science, I would say. And I think I found this really, really interesting, apart from all the, emotional and psychological stresses of the pandemic. There were also very interesting things going on. Where we saw feedbacks from human behavior. So, for example, when kids went back to school, we saw a spike in COVID cases. We also saw in lifetime issues of biological mutation and adaptation, and the associated uncertainty and changes in policy. We also, I think, saw some of the patterns of existing inequality and disadvantage in our society really dramatically highlighted because of the pandemic, and I'll explain that a bit more. I won't go into the others because there's so many interesting things that pandemic did highlight, including, I would say, a lot of these elements are to do with the importance of having a well-being approach to society, to recreating our society more towards well-being goals, and some indications and hints of how we might do that, perhaps. But I also wanted to say, I just thought it was really inspiring as well to see the level of global cooperation that was going on. And this is a kind of little rather fanciful but rather lovely diagram, which I think kind of indicates, the potential of like a global neural network. Many people of basic good intention trying to help humanity sort out our problems. And it's very easy to overlook this sometimes when you look at the news, which always focuses on all the problems and how dreadful people are. But during the pandemic, we saw an amazing amount of excellent global cooperation, although of course it had its limits, including the fact that generally speaking, rich countries were not terribly generous in helping developing countries or poorer countries with vaccines. So I just wanted to come on to the points about ethnic minority death rates and how a shock to the system can actually really demonstrate existing patterns of inequality. And this is my sort of systems dynamic mapping. I'm sure there are many more elements and connections that could be put in here. I was trying to I was doing this as part of an exercise towards writing a chapter about designing economy for equality. So if we have a shock like the pandemic, it feeds into existing patterns. And what we have, let's start with discrimination. Discrimination helps to lead to poor housing. Discrimination also involves experiences of violence and trauma. Now, both of these contribute towards existing poor health, and by that I mean poor health that predated the pandemic. Discrimination also tends to lead to lower paid jobs, and they tend to have more contact risk, and that feeds into existing poor health and indeed can feed directly into mortality. So perhaps I should have put in another arrow straight from low paid jobs to mortality. So the pandemic increases the existing poor health and consequently results in mortality for some. And when you start thinking about the balancing loop, so this is a reinforcing loop. All these things are reinforcing a complex of inequality. The balancing loop that society likes to put in place for all these areas is education. This is really the only balancing loop that we generally have or highlight is education. This gives a chance for supposedly, social mobility and a route out of this complex that people are trapped in. But can this really ever achieve this result by itself? Well, I would say the answer is very obviously no. It's, was the government's COVID support, did that take account of the extra risks and health risks for oppressed groups? No, because it was actually relatively neutral. It aimed to keep the situation going as it was before. It wasn't aiming to achieve more equality. And in fact, we've seen when we've had climate risks, so the massive flooding in Atlanta, in Georgia, New Orleans in Georgia, all the data from that shows that currently the compensation schemes actually mean that people who had something, who had assets and so on before, end up richer than they were before, whereas poorer people actually end up with less than nothing. This is a real serious problem of how we arrange compensatory regimes in our society when we have disasters and things go wrong, that needs more attention, and systems approaches can help you understand the basic structure of the problem. So when we're thinking about public health in Wales, I would like to say that systems can help at all sorts of levels, and just let's distinguish between them. So if we start off from tactical, of course, if we just look at tactical solutions, we can often end up ignoring the wider system and not being strategic. And I think that's partly why many organisations are now coming to the conclusion that we've got to have a systems approach, because we're building up chronic problems in our systems. We can't just afford to be tactical. That doesn't mean to say we don't take action at a tactical level, but the action we do take needs to be informed by a more strategic approach to our goals, and a longer term approach to our goals as well. This also means that we might need to make changes in the operational approach. So how do we actually deliver some of the things that we try to achieve, especially with people? And this means looking at the different roles that different organisations may have, both within perhaps the public health, a formal public health system, and other civil society groups and stakeholder and user groups. I mean, I know that everybody kind of knows this, and a lot of really great practice is already in place. It's just that I think that systems thinking and working together using some systems tools can really help us see a joint picture very often and understand each other's role in the system. Yeah, so I guess there's another thing about public health, and just to go back to thinking about that diagram which looked at food and public health. We know that in order to improve public health and thinking about wider determinants of public health, we need there to be transitions and changes in other parts of our systems, like the food system. We need more access to nature and exercise. We need a whole lot of other things to be changing. So how can we begin to work with other areas to see, okay, what's the bit that we can be doing? How can we liaise with these other areas, people who are working in these other areas, in order to have complementary measures so that we're all working on the same kind of map, if you like. I think there's something really, really central as well about precautionary action and expenditure. We do have a system which tends to chuck money at things when they go wrong. And there's a great presumption against spending money up front to ensure that risks don't happen. And I think, we need to extend the understanding of systemic risks more widely in society in order to justify the necessary precautionary action and expenditure that we absolutely have to put in place. And I guess, again, it's about telling the story, this other point about capturing the value. How can we tell a rich story about how our actions and our joined up approaches can help deliver complex value to the complex beings that they're trying to help, that is people, in all sorts of different ways? Another way of approaching this is through a kind of circular economy approach, where we look at perhaps the economy and how it works in a particular area. What waste is produced? How do we use the water? How is food produced? And what are the health issues? And how do they all interrelate in a particular area? How can a local authority, for example, make sense of what's going on within these interconnected systems in their own area? And then if we decide we need to intervene, what does a systemic intervention mean? And how does it differ from normal practice of perhaps incremental improvements? What does this mean for staff and partner capacity building, for example, and the different kinds of tools and events that we can put on together for learning and evaluating and coming up with ideas for interventions and strategic plans. This is a bit of a big one, but let's just have a little look around this wheel. So these are just kind of different ways that the text that isn't in boxes is supposed to refer to all the different kinds of systems approaches that we can use. So making sense of problems in a complex world, we can use rich picture mapping, we can develop system storytelling for organizations' challenges, we can use simple causal loop diagrams, as I've introduced earlier, showing reinforcing and balancing feedbacks. let's say, clarifying goals and problems in a wider view. We can create a bigger map with our different stakeholders and involve them in helping us map the system, so that and that way we find out the different ideas that people have got, but also the different misunderstandings and the different roles that people have in the system. I guess one of the reasons I love systems thinking is it's so good for revealing and articulating stuff that doesn't get spoken about, or it tends to get hidden. And there's so much of this that we sort of know about on a low level of our, consciousness, let's say, but we're so stuck in firefighting or dealing with our day-to-day work challenges that we often don't find the time to really surface this stuff. And sometimes it's that stuff that is really underpinning a lot of the problems that we have. And that's when we need, transformational strategies, including different ways of working and different capacity building within our organizations, and also different ways of communicating what we do. Quite a lot of public health, for example, is about systemic risks and typical and recurrent traps that people fall into and society falls into. How can we extend the understanding of systems risks in wider society? And then I guess there's also, we can do a lot ourselves, a hell of a lot, more than people think, using the knowledge that we already have. But sometimes we might need to commission or research something. How do you actually find out what it is that you don't know? And systems trying to develop a systems account of issues is often a good way of finding out what it is that you don't know, the unknown unknowns, which are the really tricky things. Okay, so that's just a bit of a big one. But at the end of the day, it really is about people together on a learning journey. And I think it's really important to stress that not only can this be, it's stressful thinking about the complexity of the challenges that we all face, but it is also very enriching to do this stuff with other people and to begin to understand what it is that they have got to bring to the table. And I've had so many experiences now of successful interchange where, with working with other people, you get such a rich picture of what the situation is and what needs to happen. It's actually very encouraging, but it's also a wonderful, insightful learning experience, which has its very joyful side. And it's very important to have a bit of fun and play around as well, because that's partly how us humans do creativity, in having fun and getting on with each other. And yes, so that's my learning society slide. And I love this work of art that comes from the Burning Man Festival, which, if you like, sometimes the way I interpret this, of course, we all interpret art differently, which is partly why it's so great. We have these different conceptual frameworks that we're all brought up in, particular approaches to things and particular strategies that we use to deal with life, and they can really separate us. But at heart, humans are exceptionally collaborative and social species, and it's always our deeper wish to understand how to work together. And I think that, just to be a little bit idealistic, I think that systems thinking can really help us begin to make that happen more towards our collective well-being goals. So I just wanted to introduce you to the 4 people in the forum, Wales Systems Forum. So we've set this up to try and help, to be there for, to help people with systems, approaches, consultancy, training and learning. We're interested in working with all different sorts of different kinds of organisations. And there's myself, and you probably all already know a bit about me from listening to me. I've worked with lots of different organisations. My colleague Jake, who's worked with a lot of environmental organisations and government, and is an expert in new forms of valuation that can capture rich outcomes. And this has been done in Wales with regard to health and environmental issues. So that's really interesting. And Sheila Llewellyn, who sort of has an amazing networked from her massive experience of working with NGOs and voluntary organisations. She's got a fantastic network of contacts and understanding of what's going on, but also has worked with a lot of co-creation approaches and is really interesting to work with organisations to try and get wider outcomes, and especially thinking about local resilience and well-being, and resilience being a very important part of a well-being agenda, the ability to deal with shocks. And that needs to happen, you know, at a personal level and a community level, as we saw very much with the pandemic experience. And Mike Parker, who is my brother, and who works with neuroscience approaches. And so he's interested in how the mind works, but also all sorts of things around, for example, how we practice cognitive and emotional empathy, and they are not always the same thing. How we can be empathic without being overwhelmed. I think that's terribly important for a lot of us as we try and change things and make things better. We engage with a lot of trauma and sorrow, and how can we deal with this? Mike's currently working on social systemic causes of trauma and how we can help you know, those who can't access the care and mental health services they need, perhaps, or don't necessarily understand that they would benefit from them. He's working with Pobl clients and managers at Pobl, the housing association in Wales. Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and just a little bit of information and contact material here. If you'd like to get in touch, we'd love to hear from you. We are hoping to set up a series of systems thinking events with a focus on Wales in the new year. So if you'd like to be kept informed of those, do get in touch. So thanks again for listening.